God, give me strength! We're almost there! Watch the waves!
The ramp hasn't dropped yet, but I can already smell it. The metallic tong of blood mixed with salt spray and diesel exhaust. My name is Edward Bhaul. On that gray morning of June 6, 1944, I wasn't a hero. I was a terrified kid from Ohio trying to breathe through a throat tightened by sheer paralyzing horror. We were packed into the LCVP like cattle led to slaughter. The cold waves of the Atlantic slammed against the steel hull, and every thud felt like the ocean itself was warning us to turn back. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, choked with the smoke of 1,000 fires. You could hear it before you saw it. The relentless, rhythmic thud, dash thud, dash thud of German 88s, and the terrifying high-pitched rip of the MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaws waiting for us on the bluffs of Colleville. When that ramp finally fell, the world turned into a screaming chaos of red and gray. Men I'd shared coffee with an hour ago were gone in a heartbeat, wiped out before their boots even touched French soil. I hid the waist, deep water, the weight of my gear dragging me toward a sandy grave. I found a sliver of sanctuary behind a jagged steel hedgehog, the freezing surf pulling at my boots. From there, through the haze and the spray, I saw the muzzle flashes from bunker gun 6-2. I didn't feel brave. I felt small. I squeezed my M1 Garand not to be a marksman, but because firing back was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. The echoes of Omaha Beach still resonate in the heavy silence of our history, a haunting reminder of the staggering price paid for the ground we walk on today. We don't tell these stories to glorify the carnage, but to ensure that the names of the men who fell in the cold Atlantic surf are never erased by time. If you believe in preserving the legacy of veterans like Edward Bhaul and the brothers he lost that day, please subscribe to Ground Zero Stories. Join us. Let's ensure their sacrifice continues to echo, lest we forget. The English Channel was a churning gray beast, and we were trapped in its iron belly. The Higgins boat bucked against the swell, throwing salt spray over the sides to mix with the vomit and diesel fumes on the floor. I looked at the boys around me. Their faces were pale, etched with a terror that no amount of training prepares you for. When the ramp dropped, the front rank was simply erased. There's no other word for it, I didn't think. I just leaped into the freezing water, stumbling over the bodies of men who had been alive seconds before. Omaha wasn't a beach, it was an altar of sacrifice. I dragged myself to a rusted steel obstacle. To my left, a whole unit was being systematically torn apart by that bunker on the bluff. The MG-42 was relentless. I felt the weight of my rifle, the wood damp and slick. I wasn't hunting for glory. I was hunting for a second of silence so I could breathe. I waited for the smoke to shift, sighted a flicker of movement in the pillbox slit, and fired. I didn't count the kills. I just counted the seconds of reprieve. Every time that gun stopped barking, it meant one more of my brothers might make it to the shingle. The water had turned a sickening translucent red. As I rolled over the side of the boat, nearly 80 pounds of equipment dragged me down. I clawed my way to the shore, gasping for air that tasted like sulfur. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the iron tong of fresh blood. I found myself pressed against the seawall next to Sergeant Miller and a kid named Kowalski. The sergeant was screaming, but his voice was drowned by the thud, dash thud, dash thud of the naval guns and the rip of the German lead. We were pinned. The sand was dancing with the impact of bullets. "We have to move," Miller bellowed. "If we stay here, we're just targets." We began the agonizing crawl. Every inch was paid for in lives. I saw a medic trying to patch a man whose legs were gone. Seconds later, the medic was slumped over him. That was the moment the fear turned into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I began to return fire, aiming for the flashes in the bunkers. I wasn't a sniper. I was a desperate man with a rifle. I remember the kick of the Garand against my shoulder, a rhythmic punctuation to the madness. Reaching the base of the cliff was a nightmare of loose shale and barbed wire. Kowalski had the satchel charges. We moved through the smoke like ghosts. As we neared the first pillbox, I could hear the Germans shouting, the metallic clatter of spent casings hitting the concrete floor. Miller signaled. I emptied a clip into the embrasure, forcing them to duck. In that window of 3 seconds, Kowalski shoved the charge through. The explosion rattled my teeth. We stormed the rear entrance. Inside, the air was a suffocating mix of cordite and dust. 2 Germans were reaching for their sidearms. I fired, and they fell. I stood there, chest heaving, looking at them. They were just boys. One had a photo tucked into his belt. I walked to the gun slit and looked back at the beach. Hundreds of American bodies littered the sand like driftwood. We had won this tiny piece of France, but the cost was etched into every wave. I felt no triumph, only a crushing weight. We exited the rear of the bunker into a network of zigzagging trenches. This was the maze, a world of mud-slicked walls and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay around the next corner. In these trenches, the Great Crusade vanished. There was only the next 5 yards of dirt. We heard it first, the shout of hand grenade, followed by a crack that rang my ears until all I heard was a high-pitched whine. I rounded a corner and saw 2 Germans resetting a weapon. I fired before they could look up. The numbers didn't bring satisfaction. Each one was a life, a family, a story ending in the mud. Suddenly, Miller's helmet spun off with a metallic clack. He collapsed, bleeding from a graze. A sniper. The shot came from a concealed spider hole inland. We were pinned. Any movement brought a precision shot. I pulled out a jagged piece of trench mirror and angled it over the lip. There, 200 yards out, in the ruins of a stone shed, a flicker of lens flare. I signaled the squad for suppressive fire. On my count, they emptied their mags. In that split second, I rose and sighted the shadow. I squeezed the trigger. The shadow slumped. We didn't celebrate. We just ran, clearing foxholes with a ferocity born of pure, unadulterated fear. By the time we reached the plateau, I was a different man. The real horror of the trenches wasn't just the dying. It was how quickly you became used to the killing. The ringing in my ears was the only thing that filled the hollow silence of the final bunker. I stepped out, my boots crunching on spent shell casings. I looked at my hands. They were shaking from the adrenaline dump. I saw a small cluster of olive-drab figures emerging from the smoke. "Bhaul, is that you?" It was Miller. His face was a mask of soot. We just stared at each other, 2 ghosts in a graveyard. Slowly, more shadows materialized. Jackson, Henderson. We were supposed to be a platoon of 40. There were only 7 of us left. The camaraderie of training, the jokes, the shared dreams, it had all been incinerated. I walked to the edge and looked down at Omaha one last time. The tide was coming in, pushing the debris of the invasion further onto the shore. Hundreds of bodies scattered like discarded dolls. Thompson, Riley, Captain Taylor. They weren't names on a list. They were my brothers. "We have to keep moving, Edward," Miller said, his voice devoid of emotion. He was right. In the army, grief is a luxury. We began to reorganize, scrounging for ammo from the packs of the fallen. I found a bandolier near a dead paratrooper and looped it over my shoulder. We weren't a unit anymore. We were fragments held together by the necessity of breathing. We turned our backs on the carnage, pushing into the hedgerows. Behind us, the naval guns continued to roar, but for us, the world had narrowed down to the next bush, the next stone wall, and the heavy, crushing silence of those who weren't walking with us.